Welcome everyone. We're delighted to welcome you to the TESS Talk for this session. This is part of the Thinking Expansively seminar series, which is hosted by the GCSJ, along with a whole set of other programs. So if you're unfamiliar with the GCSJ set of events, please do go to the website and the YouTube channels, etc., for recordings of our previous events. Today, I am delighted to welcome Professor Addae-Kyeremeh. He is a professor of educational leadership and development and the head of school of education, childhood, youth and sports at the Open University. So usually our other speakers for TESS Talks are from everywhere, not necessarily just the OU. And so it's particularly exciting and delightful to have Eric from the OU speaking today. With more than 20 years of experience in education, Eric is committed to advancing innovation, equity, and excellence in his teaching, research, and leadership development. His research concentrates on education leadership, evidence-based practice, and teacher professional development, which is underpinned by extensive international collaborations across the UK, EU, West Africa, and South Asia. And today his talk will examine the importance of recentering African values, cultural knowledge systems, and relational forms of leadership in education, and explain why these approaches are critical for building equitable, empowering learning environments. So over to you, Eric. And whilst people are listening to the talk, if you have any questions, comments, you could either put them in the chat or you can wait till the Q&A session in the later part of the session. So thank you so very much. Eric, on to you.
Thanks very much, Gunjan, for inviting me, and greetings everyone, and thank you for joining this seminar, which I have titled Afrocentric Pedagogical Leadership in Action Towards Culturally Empowered Learning. As Gunjan said, my name is Eric Addae. The KY is pronounced CH, so just in case you don't know, you know now for future reference. So it's Eric Addae-Kyeremeh, and I'm a professor of educational leadership and development here at the OU. Much of my work involves collaborating with communities, practitioners, and policymakers, mainly to generate knowledge that not only describes educational challenges, but seeks to transform systems and the lived experience of learners. As I always say, I'm less interested in observing change from a distance and far more committed to co-creating change with the people who live it every day. My focus is on real-world impact, on building leadership and pedagogical practices that honor cultural wisdom, restore agency, and create learning environments where every child can recognize themselves, their story, and their possibility. I will take us through 4 interconnected elements that frame today's discussion. First, I will explore why this conversation is necessary, why pedagogical leadership cannot be culturally neutral, and why African epistemologies and ways of knowing must be centered if we are serious about justice, dignity, and meaningful learning. Second, I will outline the intellectual foundations that underpin Afrocentric pedagogical leadership. Third, I will introduce the 5 principles behind Afrocentric pedagogical leadership, principles that foreground cultural grounding, relationality, inclusivity, liberation, and decolonial approaches to evidence. And finally, I will share a practical application from Ghana, where colleagues and I work with teachers, head teachers, and school improvement officers in a participatory research process to co-create a toolkit or a resource based on these principles. This work illustrates not only the theory of Afrocentric pedagogical leadership, but also how it can be enacted in real-world settings to produce culturally grounded and empowering learning experience. So this is where we're going today. So why this conversation? I was working on a curriculum review for basic education in Ghana, and a head teacher said to me, "Our children learn everything except themselves." This stayed with me because it encapsulates a global pattern where educational systems shaped by colonial histories still marginalize African epistemologies, languages, and lived realities. For decades, if not centuries, we have seen Eurocentric models presented as universal. We have seen African knowledge positioned as supplementary. We see learners forced to work in spaces where they cannot always recognize themselves. But today, across the world, educators and leaders are grappling with profound questions about equity, identity, and cultural relevance in our classrooms. We are increasingly recognizing that meaningful learning cannot happen if learners do not see themselves in their history and their histories, their languages, their communities reflected and valued in the educational experience. Afrocentric Pedagogical Leadership, which I've abbreviated as APL, responds to this. It recenters cultural dignity, agency, and epistemic justice as the foundations of pedagogical leadership. McNeil et al. 2005 argue that a pedagogic leader is driven by the moral and social notions of developing the whole child, while acknowledging the socio-political context of learning. This notion extends a view of learning and knowledge beyond the curriculum, while also acknowledging the social political influences of learning environments. This includes the set of beliefs, values, and principles that guide leadership practice. So when pedagogical leadership is not culturally grounded, it erases community knowledge. Education becomes something done to communities, not with them. We begin to trust external metrics more than lived experience. We define learners by deficiencies rather than by potentials. We create leadership that is managerial instead of being transformative. So this seminar is grounded in a collaborative study I'm conducting with Dr. Jane Cullen and Dr. Margaret Ibuwedike from the OU and Dr. Chris Kwa from the University of Cape Coast. Together, we've been exploring what Afrocentric pedagogic leadership looks like in practice and how it can offer new pathways for culturally empowered learning across contexts and globally. I mean, that covers the in-action part of my talk, which I'll pick up later. Our work sits firmly on the intellectual foundations laid by Molefe Kete Asante, Kwame Nkrumah, and Paulo Freire. This work holds particular significance in African context, so bear with me when I'm drawing a lot of my examples from countries around Africa. But it bears significance in African context because it can enhance student outcomes, promote holistic development, and contribute to the broader goals of educational equity and empowerment, as has been set out in a number of policy documents within the continent. It also emphasizes collaboration with families and communities, something very, very important. Therefore, Afrocentric pedagogical leadership can foster inclusive, student-centered, and socially just education. So some of the questions that I have exercised are fundamental ones. And some of them are, why is pedagogy important? What counts as learning? And for us, these questions are not simply academic curiosities. They are profoundly political. The way we answer them determines whose knowledge is elevated and whose is ignored, what we value in our system, who is recognized as a knower, and what forms of success are celebrated or dismissed. For us, these questions shape curriculum, teacher development, leadership practice, and everyday experiences of our learners. So at the intersection of these questions lies the heart of Afrocentric pedagogical leadership. This invites us to rethink pedagogy not as a neutral technique, but as a cultural, ethical, and political act. It challenges us to ask what worldviews underpin our teaching, whose histories shape our content, whose voices define learning, and crucially, what ways of knowing do we legitimize when we lead? This is why pedagogy matters. And this is why learning must be reclaimed as positioned by some of the thinkers we draw from. And this is why Afrocentric pedagogical leadership is so necessary today. So the intellectual roots of our work. Firstly, we draw a lot on Molefe Asante's work and his work around Afrocentricity. And for Asante, Afrocentricity repositions African people as agents, subjects of knowledge and not objects. It insists that cultural location, language, lived experience, and worldview shape meaning. It demands that we recognize culture, location, and language and identity as central and not peripheral to knowledge. Asante, and indeed my colleagues and I, do not dismiss European, American, or Asian bodies of knowledge. Rather, we argue that it is essential for African ideas, worldviews, and epistemologies to be placed at the center of any analysis that seeks to understand or influence African culture, behavior, educational practice, or knowledge production. This is not a rejection of global knowledge traditions. It is an insistence on epistemic location, that African realities are best interpreted through African intellectual frameworks, and that any meaningful understanding must begin from the center of African experience, not from its margins. The second intellectual route is from Kwame Nkrumah's conscientism. For Kwame Nkrumah, the key highlights are decolonization as an ideological process, a liberation of consciousness rooted in African humanism. Nkrumah insists that African leadership must ground itself in an ethical humanism rooted in communal responsibility and the liberation of consciousness. This provides the ideological clarity necessary for decolonization. The third thinker that I'm sure most people will be familiar with, is Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy dialogues, which focus on humanization and education as the practice of freedom. For us, this aligns deeply with African communal philosophies. It adds the dimension of dialogue, humanization, and praxis. Freire reminds us that education is never neutral. It either humanizes or dehumanizes, liberates or domesticates. Together, these traditions form the intellectual architecture of Afrocentric pedagogical leadership, a leadership model that we're developing, which we believe is culturally grounded, ethically humanistic, and liberatory. So from these thinkers and from our research, I articulate 5 core principles that shape Afrocentric pedagogical leadership. First is cultural grounding in pedagogy. For us, this is an important attribute that every pedagogical leadership within the African system or the African context should think about, reflect on, and adhere to. This begins with recognizing that teaching must start from the African cultural knowledge, languages, worldviews, and lived realities. When we teach from where learners are, rather than where the curriculum assumes they should be, we create learning that feels relevant, affirming, and meaningful. The second principle we refer to as Ubuntu-inspired inclusivity. For us, this is rooted in the philosophy of Ubuntu, the idea that I am because we are. And within the Afrocentric pedagogical leadership frame, leadership becomes relational, communal, and grounded in dignity and belonging. It reminds us that education is not an individual pursuit, but a collective responsibility. The third principle we describe as decolonial data praxis. And for us, and for every Afrocentric pedagogical leader, this principle challenges us to rethink how we use evidence, research, and the metrics. Instead of tools for surveillance or deficit narratives, data becomes something generated from African standpoints, something that empowers communities, informs justice-oriented decision-making, and honest context. The fourth principle is around creating liberatory learning spaces. Our classrooms and educational spaces must be places where identity is affirmed. For us, this should be a place where learners experience psychological freedom and where decolonial consciousness is nurtured. These are spaces that enable learners not just to succeed academically, but to see themselves as full, valued human beings. The fifth principle is about empowerment through relational leadership. For us, this is leadership that is ethical, collaborative, and deeply human-centered. It seeks not just to manage systems, but to transform them, building trust, allowing agency, and shared responsibility across communities. So for us, together, these 5 principles help us imagine an educational landscape that is culturally grounded, socially just, and deeply empowering. So today, as we move through this seminar, I invite you to reflect on these principles and how they resonate with your own practice. How might cultural grounding deepen the relevance of your teaching? How might Ubuntu reshape your leadership? And how can we work collectively to build liberatory educational spaces that truly honor the dignity, identity, and potential of every learner? So let's get through the principles one after the other. So the first principle is about cultural grounding in pedagogy. And what do we mean by that? This is rooted in culturally sustaining pedagogy and some of the work from Mesro and Frere. This principle calls for teaching practices that affirm and extend learners' cultural identities. So in this space, the Afrocentric pedagogical leader promotes culturally relevant and responsive curricula that validate African worldviews, languages, and histories. It positions culture as central to both the content and the pedagogy. This is about more than adding African proverbs to a lesson plan. It's about centering culture as the foundation of how we teach, what we teach, and why we teach. Let me take you to a classroom in Ghana. The teacher begins the day not with a textbook, but with a story, an Anansi story. The children listen, they laugh, and reflect. Then they discuss the moral of the story, connect it to their own lives, and write their own endings. For me, this is not just literacy, this is cultural affirmation. In Ghana, integrating local languages like Twi, Ga, Ewe, and Dagbani into early childhood education has led to improved literacy and engagement. Why? Because when children learn in their mother tongue, they don't just understand better, they feel seen. But cultural grounding also means challenging the erosions of values. Africans admire the discipline of the Japanese and Singaporean students, yet in many of our schools, discipline is declining. Why? Because we've distanced ourselves from our own system of moral education, storytelling, rites of passage, and the role of elders, etc. So for me, and for us, cultural grounding is about reclaiming these cultural assets. It's important that we embed them in the curriculum, our assessment, and leadership practices. It is very important that the cultural grounding allows us to teach and affirm the identity of these students, honor their heritage, and build on their pride. So I ask you to pause and reflect whilst we move on. So what cultural practices from your own upbringing could enrich your teaching today? A young learner once said, I didn't know science could be about my own world. I mean, this was kind of touched me a lot when the young learner said that. I mean, that moment for me captures the power of cultural grounding, because when learning reflects the learner's life, culture, and environment and identity, it allows agency to emerge. As Asante argues, Afrocentricity is not cultural celebration, it's epistemic correction. Frere reminds us that reading the world precedes reading the word. Leaders must ensure that pedagogy starts with the learner's world, not an imported abstraction. The second principle is what we describe as Ubuntu-inspired inclusivity. I am because we are. And for us, what does this mean? For us, it's not just a philosophy, it's a way of being, a way of leading, and a way of learning. What does truly inclusive leadership look like in the African education context? Let me reshare a story that a school leader shared with me at a conference some years ago. In a township school in Uganda, a principal began holding monthly Ubuntu circles. These are gatherings where parents, teachers, and students shared stories, concerns, and dreams. Over time, trust grew, attendance improved, and discipline issues declined. Why? Because people felt heard, they felt valued. This is not just about representation. It's about embracing the knowledge, wisdom, values, and the voices of communities, and leading in ways that honor the humanity of every learner, teacher, and parent. For us, this is Ubuntu in action. Education that is relational, education that is grounded in care, connection, community wisdom, and one that strengthens sense of belonging. So a reflection point for you is, how do you create spaces of belonging in your own school, classroom, seminar, etc.? In a community meeting a while back, a parent said to me, education only works when we are part of it. And for me, that is Ubuntu in its full realization, because Ubuntu teaches us that humanity is relational. Nkrumah speaks of ethical collectivism, which is in line with this, and Ferrer speaks of dialogue as oxygen of learning. So within the Afrocentric Pedagogical Leadership framework, inclusivity is not a gesture, it's epistemic. It demands leadership that sees community knowledge as a co-authoritative piece and not peripheral. The third principle we describe as decolonial data praxis. A community member once challenged an external report that I worked on, saying that this data does not describe us. And they were right. Data is not neutral. It reflects the worldview of the people who design it. Deficit-based data shapes deficit-based leadership. When data is extracted without context, community voices are erased. Ferrer teaches us to question the politics of knowledge. Nkrumah urges ideological clarity, and Asante insists on narrative sovereignty. So let's be honest. Too often, metrics used in African contexts are borrowed, benchmarks are imported, and definitions of success are not African. But what truly matters in education? Is it test scores? Or is it resilience, creativity, compassion? That's something for everyone to reflect on. So when we talk about the decolonial data praxis, this invites us to rethink what we measure, how we measure it, and most importantly, who defines success. It means recognizing indigenous knowledge systems and community wisdom. So what counts as evidence of success in education, you may ask? Well, I'll answer by asking some questions. What does thriving look like in your community? What stories aren't being told by the data? And what are we calling a gap that might actually be a strength? Now, what I've just done is to respond to a question with more questions. Growing up in Ghana, this approach was often seen as a weakness, as if answering a question with another question meant you didn't know the answer. But through my journey as an educator and coach, I've come to understand the power of inquiry. In coaching, I've had to strengthen my ability to ask meaningful questions, not just to provide answers, but to guide others in discovering their own. For us, this pillar then is about more than data. It's about honoring context, challenging deficit narratives, and reimagining what counts as evidence. Instead of relying solely on imported metrics and performance indicators, pedagogical leadership, Afrocentric pedagogical leaders must elevate local knowledge, co-create indigenous indicators of success, and embrace participatory forms of evaluation that reflect African values and realities. I understand this is happening already, but let's do more. For example, in Ghana, some schools now use community-based assessments, where elders, parents, and teachers co-evaluate student growth based on values like responsibility, collaboration, and innovation. In Nigeria, participatory school mapping has helped leaders identify and address local barriers to learning, like unsafe routes to school or lack of menstrual hygiene facilities. So a reflection point then here is, what is one thing you wish your school measured that it currently doesn't? The fourth principle is about creating liberatory learning spaces. And what do we mean by this? For us, education at its best is not about memorization, it's about liberation. These principles, influenced by transformative education theory, seeks to create conditions for critical reflection, identity development, and social transformation. Learning becomes a process of liberation where students are empowered to challenge dominant narratives and reclaim their stories, their histories, and their futures. In too many of our African classrooms, students are taught to repeat, not to reflect, to conform, not to question. But true learning begins with critical consciousness, with the courage to ask why. So while we focus on literacy, or should I be blunt and say, while we focus on learning to read and write in the colonizer's language, we forget that true liberation lies in our ability to think and act critically. This disposition does not know language. So what does it truly mean to lead for critical thinking in African classrooms? It starts with self-awareness of who we are as educators, where our educational practices come from, and how they shape our learners' experiences. It grows through critical reflection, asking the hard questions about power, culture, and purpose. It flourishes in learner-centered, community-rooted pedagogy that creates space for voice, identity, and growth. In the classroom and school compounds, we should put the next generation on pathways to liberation, where learners challenge dominant narratives. As Afrocentric pedagogical leaders, we should remind ourselves that self-reflective teaching practices are not optional, but the foundation of transformative education. So in Kenya, the Elimu Year 2 Coalition has worked with schools to integrate African history and civic education into the curriculum. Students learn not just about colonialism, but about resistance, not just about independence, but about interdependence. In Ghana, imagine a classroom where students debate the legacy of Kwame Nkrumah or explore the symbolism of Adinkra in art and ethics. These are not just lessons, they are acts of liberation. So a reflection point then on this principle is, what dominant narratives are you helping your students to unlearn? The fifth and final principle in this framework is empowerment through relational leadership. This pillar, this principle for us is about empowerment through relational practice. It encourages us to lead with empathy, connection, local contextual understanding, and accountability. This principle recognizes that strong relationships are not a soft part of leadership. They are the structure that holds everything else up. This isn't about hierarchical leadership, but rather about building trustworthy relationships. It's about building cultures of mutual growth and shared purpose, where teachers, learners, leaders, and communities thrive together. In practice, this means listening deeply to everyone. It means mentoring with humility, and it means creating cultures of mutual growth and shared purpose. A colleague once told me, leadership is helping someone become more of themselves. And that's one of the things that I've always aimed to do. I love this because it captures the relational leadership beautifully. Ubuntu teaches shared humanity. Ferre positions leaders as co-investigators, and Asante emphasizes agency over authority. So for us, Afrocentric pedagogical leadership reframes leadership as a process of relational empowerment, not hierarchy, not control, but co-creation. So the reflective question on this principle is, who mentored you into leadership? How are you paying that forward? So prior to the session, I did pose some reflective questions, and I'm sure you've had time to reflect on them. I could have started the session by looking at these reflective questions, but I thought that I'll go through the key intellectual roots of the Afrocentric pedagogical leadership before revisiting the reflective questions that I posed. So these were: who gets to define what counts as good pedagogy and leadership? Have African philosophies and epistemologies been marginalized in this debate? And what would learning and teaching look like in African education systems if grounded in African ways of knowing? What I'm hoping is that, based on what I've kind of discussed or presented so far, it'll help you in terms of providing your own responses to these reflective questions. But what is clear to us whilst working on this framework is that leadership is never neutral, because every act of leading legitimizes certain forms of knowledge while silencing others. So from an Afrocentric pedagogical leadership perspective, the question, what knowledge do we legitimize when we lead, becomes a profound inquiry into power, identity, and the politics of learning. So Afrocentric pedagogical leadership begins with recognition that leadership legitimizes the knowledge it centers. So when leaders prioritize Eurocentric theories, Western metrics of success, or externally imposed models of quality, they inadvertently extend the long shadow of colonial epistemologies. They reproduce deficit narratives and position African learners, educators, and communities as peripheral or lacking. Leadership in this mode becomes an instrument of epistemic dominance. So for us, Afrocentric pedagogical leadership offers a different answer. To lead through an Afrocentric lens is to consciously legitimize the cultural knowledge embedded in African histories, languages, and lived realities. A communal ethics of Ubuntu that recognizes humanity as interdependent, the liberatory traditions that refuse the normalization of inequality, the data practices that honor context, dignity, and humanity, and finally, the relational leadership models that the relational leadership models that see knowledge as co-constructed rather than imposed. So Afrocentric pedagogical leaders should ask themselves, whose worldview shapes the decisions we call best practice? Whose voice is amplified and whose is rendered silent? What forms of knowing do we treat as credible, rigorous, or worthy of institutional endorsement? These are questions that I leave with you as you reflect on what we've talked about.
Eric, I just want to say you've got about 5 more minutes.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so the timing is right here. So I'm going to rush through this side of the talk. So bear with me. I wish I had the whole day to take you through this. So based on these foundations and intellectual roots and the 5 principles, we've tried to put this Afrocentric pedagogical leadership into practice. So through a participatory research process, my colleagues and I worked closely with teachers, head teachers, and school improvement and support officers, referred to as CISOs in Ghana, to co-create a professional learning toolkit grounded in the 5 principles of Afrocentric pedagogical leadership. The resource emerged from collaborative inquiry, storytelling, and reflective dialogue, ensuring that the knowledge embedded within it was shaped by the lived realities, cultural knowledge, and the leadership practices of Ghanaian educators themselves. In this way, the toolkit not only reflects the principles of Afrocentric pedagogical leadership, but it embodies them, operationalizing cultural grounding, Ubuntu-inspired inclusivity, liberatory pedagogies, decolonial data practices, and relational empowerment in contextually rooted ways. So when I mentioned the inaction part at the start of the talk, that's what we've done. So we've tried to put these 5 principles into action. And hopefully we're publishing this toolkit very soon. And what do we have within that toolkit? So the toolkit is divided into 4 parts. The first part looks at the foundations of Afrocentric pedagogical leadership. The second part, it's about unpacking the 5 principles or putting the 5 principles into action in the Ghanaian context. And part 3 is about implementation in practice. So how teachers, school leaders, and school improvement officers can actually enact this within their job roles. And then the 4th part is about resources, additional resources that could help them. So how have we unpacked the 5 principles within the Ghanaian context? As you can see in the diagram, for each of the principles for the toolkit, it's represented by an Akan Adinkra symbol, and these are the symbols where my cursor actually is moving towards. And the design choice is intentional because the symbols serve as visual embodiments of the philosophical meaning behind each principle, linking educational practice with deep cultural wisdom. So the Adinkra symbols offer a rich semiotic tradition through which values such as interdependence, resilience, leadership, justice, and learning are expressed. So for us, by anchoring each principle in an Adinkra motif, allows the toolkit to be memorable. It also foregrounds culturally and allows educators to be reflective and be active. The symbols function not only as aesthetic elements, but as visual and philosophical reminders of the ancestral knowledge, ethical commitments, and leadership values that underpin Afrocentric pedagogical leadership. So each of the principles are represented in an Adinkra symbol, which all have their own meanings. So I'll whiz through this quickly whilst I bring the session to an end. So the first principle which we describe, which is cultural grounding in pedagogy, is symbolized by the Adinkra symbol Sankofa, which is about emphasizing the importance of learning from the past to build a better future. So within the toolkit, we unpack this and explain the relationship between this Adinkra symbol and the principle and what the expectations are in terms of putting this into action. So there's a case study. There's some actionable pieces that need to be done to bring this to life. The second principle, which is Ubuntu-inspired inclusivity, is represented by an Akan, the Akan Adinkra symbol, which is known as Moko, and it's a symbol of inequality and uneven development. And the main reason is that we hope that this will inspire inclusivity, and that link has historical and importance to the Akan tradition. And hopefully that links clearly to Afrocentric pedagogical leadership principle 2. The third principle is about, as we said, decolonial data praxis, and this is represented with the Akan symbol Tikro Nko Ejina. And this emphasizes collaboration, consultation, and the diverse perspectives in decision making. The fourth principle, which is about liberatory learning spaces, is represented by an Akan symbol, which means he who does not know can know from learning. And the whole idea, as it was mentioned earlier on, is to get Afrocentric pedagogical leaders in Ghana to value the spaces in which learning takes place and to create and make sure that they are liberatory as much as possible. And the final one is represented by the Akan Adinkra symbol, Krontini Akwamu, which is a symbol of democracy, sharing ideas, and taking counsel. And as the principle goes, it's mainly about empowerment through relational leadership. So our main reason for relating these Adinkra symbols to the principles, as I said earlier on, is to make colleagues connect their own histories, make sure that they are present, and make sure that these are symbols that relate to the cultural context, so that when they are enacting this in the classroom environment, they're able to make the linkages that drive transformational education as we've hoped to achieve. So that's where I will leave it. Thank you for listening. And as I said, the toolkit will be published hopefully soon. And the toolkit is divided into 4 parts. So beyond the theoretical foundations, there are exemplars in there, and there are directions on how to bring this to life within the Ghanaian context. And we're hoping that we'll be able to extend this beyond Ghana, because it sits within an Afrocentric paradigm. So thanks for listening.